Chapter 7. Tuesday was a gloomy day in late November. Occasional cold, gusty showers drifted over the hills. The world seemed a dreary, outlived place, seen through a gray drizzle. Poor Dovey hasn't a very nice day for her wedding, thought Anne. Suppose, she quaked and shivered. Suppose it doesn't turn out well after all. It will be my fault. Dovey would never have agreed to it if I hadn't advised her to, and suppose Franklin Westcott never forgives her. Anne Shirley, stop this. The weather is all that's the matter with you. By night, the rain had ceased, but the air was cold and raw, and the sky lowering. Anne was in her tower room, correcting school papers with Dusty Miller coiled up under her stove. There came a thunderous knock at the front door. Anne ran down. Rebecca Dew poked an alarmed head out of her bedroom door. Anne motioned her back. "It's someone at the front door," said Rebecca hollowly. "It's all right, Rebecca dear. At least I'm afraid it's all wrong, but anyway, it's only Jarvis Morrow. I saw him from the side tower window, and I know he wants to see me." "Jarvis Morrow!" Rebecca went back and shut her door. "This is the last straw." "Jarvis, whatever is the matter?" "Dovey hasn't come," said Jarvis wildly. "We've waited hours. The minister's there, and my friends, and Julia has supper ready, and Dovey hasn't come. I waited for her at the end of the lane till I was half crazy. I didn't dare go down to the house because I didn't know what had happened. That old brute of a Franklin Westcott may have come back. Aunt Maggie may have locked her up. But I've got to know, Anne. You must go to Elmcroft and find out why she hasn't come." "Me?" said Anne, incredulously and ungrammatically. "Yes, you. There's no one else I can trust, no one else who knows. Oh, Anne, don't fail me now. You've backed us up right along. Dovey says you are the only real friend she has. It isn't late, only 9. Do go." "And be chewed up by the bulldog?" said Anne sarcastically. "That old dog," said Jarvis contemptuously. "He wouldn't say boo to a tramp. You don't suppose I was afraid of the dog, do you? Besides, he's always shut up at night. I simply don't want to make any trouble for Dovey at home if they found out. Anne, please." "I suppose I'm in for it," said Anne with a shrug of despair. Jarvis drove her to the long lane of Elmcroft, but she would not let him come further. "As you say, it might complicate matters for Dovey in case her father has come home." Anne hurried down the long tree-bordered lane. The moon occasionally broke through the windy clouds, but for the most part it was gruesomely dark, and she was not a little dubious about the dog. There seemed to be only one light in Elmcroft, shining from the kitchen window. Aunt Maggie herself opened the side door to Anne. Aunt Maggie was a very old sister of Franklin Westcott's, a little bent, wrinkled woman who had never been considered very bright mentally, though she was an excellent housekeeper. "Aunt Maggie, is Dovey home?" "Dovey's in bed," said Aunt Maggie stolidly. "In bed? Is she sick?" "Not as I knows on. She seemed to be in a dither all day. After supper she says she was tired and up and goes to bed." "I must see her for a moment, Aunt Maggie. I just want a little important information." "Better go up to her room, then. It's the one on the right side as you go up." Aunt Maggie gestured to the stairs and waddled out to the kitchen. Dovey sat up as Anne walked in rather unceremoniously after a hurried rap. As could be seen by the light of a tiny candle, Dovey was in tears, but her tears only exasperated Anne. "Dovey Westcott, did you forget that you promised to marry Jarvis Morrow tonight? Tonight?" No, whimpered Dovey. "Oh, Anne, I'm so unhappy. I've put in such a dreadful day. You can never know what I've gone through." "I know what poor Jarvis has gone through, waiting for 2 hours at that lane in the cold and drizzle," said Anne mercilessly. Is he very angry, Anne?" "Just what you could notice," bitingly. "Oh, Anne, I just got frightened. I never slept 1 wink last night. I couldn't go through with it. I couldn't. There's something disgraceful about eloping, Anne. I wouldn't get any nice presents. Well, not any anyhow. I've always wanted to be married in a church with lovely decorations and a white veil and dress and silver slippers." "Dovey Westcott, get right out of bed at once and get dressed and come with me." "Anne, it's too late now." "It isn't too late, and it's now or never. You must know that, Dovey. If you've a grain of sense, you must know Jarvis Morrow will never speak to you again if you make a fool of him like this." "Oh, Anne, he'll forgive me when he knows he won't." "I know Jarvis Morrow will. He isn't going to let you play indefinitely with his life, Dovey. Do you want me to drag you bodily out of bed?" Dovey shuddered and sighed. "I haven't any suitable dresses." "You've half a dozen pretty dresses. Put on your rose taffeta." "And I haven't any trousseau. The Morrows will always cast that up to me." "You can get one afterwards, Dovey. Didn't you weigh all these things in the balance before?" No, that's just the trouble. I only began to think of them last night, and Father—" "You don't know Father, Anne." "Dovey, I'll give you just 10 minutes to get dressed. Dovey was dressed in the specified time. This dress is getting too tight for me, she sobbed as Anne hooked her up. If I get much fatter, I don't suppose Jarvis will love me. I wish I was tall and slim and pale like you, Anne. Oh, Anne, what if Aunt Maggie hears us? She won't. She's shut in the kitchen, and you know she's a little deaf. Here's your hat and coat, and I've tumbled a few things into this bag. Oh, my heart is fluttering so. Do I look terrible, Anne? You look lovely, said Anne sincerely. Dovey's satin skin was rose and cream, and all her tears hadn't spoiled her eyes. But Jarvis couldn't see her eyes in the dark, and he was a little annoyed with his adored fair one, and rather cool during the drive to town. For heaven's sake, Dovey, don't look so scared over having to marry me, he said impatiently as she came down the stairs of the Stevens house. And don't cry. It'll make your nose swell. It's nearly 10 o'clock, and we've got to catch the 11 o'clock train. Dovey was quite all right as soon as she found herself irrevocably married to Jarvis. What Anne rather cattishly described in the letter to Gilbert as the honeymoon look was already on her face. Anne, darling, we owe it all to you. We'll never forget it, will we, Jarvis? And oh, Anne, darling, will you do just one more thing for me? Please break the news to my father. He'll be home early tomorrow evening, and somebody's got to tell him. You can smooth him over if anybody can. Please do your best to get him to forgive me. Anne felt she rather needed some smoothing over herself just then, but she also felt rather uneasily responsible for the outcome of the affair, so she gave the required promise. Of course, he'll be terrible. Simply terrible, Anne, but he can't kill you, said Dovey comfortingly. Oh, Anne, you don't know. You can't realize how safe I feel with Jarvis. When Anne got home, Rebecca Dew had reached the point where she had to satisfy her curiosity or go mad. She followed Anne to the tower room in her nightdress with a square of flannel wrapped around her head and heard the whole story. Well, I suppose this is what you might call life, she said sarcastically. But I'm real glad Franklin Westcott has got his comeuppance at last. And so will Mrs. Captain Montgomery be. But I don't envy you the job of breaking the news to him. He'll rage and utter vain things. If I was in your shoes, Miss Shirley, I wouldn't sleep one blessed wink tonight. I feel that it won't be a very pleasant experience, agreed Anne ruefully. Chapter 8. Anne betook herself to Elmcroft the next evening, walking through the dreamlike landscape of a November fog with a rather sinking sensation pervading her being. It was not exactly a delightful errand. As Dovey had said, of course Franklin Westcott wouldn't kill her, Anne did not fear physical violence, though if all the tales told of him were true, he might throw something at her. Would he gibber with rage? Anne had never seen a man gibbering with rage, and she imagined it must be a rather unpleasant sight, but he would probably exercise his noted gift for unpleasant sarcasm, and sarcasm in man or woman was the one weapon Anne dreaded. It always hurt her, raised blisters on her soul that smarted for months. Aunt Jamesina used to say, never if you can help it be the bringer of ill news, reflected Anne. She was as wise in that as in everything else. But here I am. Elmcroft was an old-fashioned house with towers at every corner and a bulbous cupola on the roof, and at the top of the flight of front steps sat the dog. If they take hold, they never let go, remembered Anne. Should she try to go round to the side door? Then the thought that Franklin Westcott might be watching her from the window braced her up. Never would she give him the satisfaction of seeing that she was afraid of his dog. Resolutely, her head held high, she marched up the steps, past the dog, and rang the bell. The dog had not stirred. When Anne glanced at him over her shoulder, he was apparently asleep. Franklin Westcott, it transpired, was not at home, but was expected every minute, as the Charlottetown train was due. Aunt Maggie convoyed Anne into what she called the Liberty and left her there. The dog had got up and followed them in. He came in and arranged himself at Anne's feet. Anne found herself liking the Liberty. It was a cheerful, shabby room with a fire glowing cozily in the grate and bearskin rugs on the worn red carpet of the floor. Franklin Westcott evidently did himself well in regard to books and pipes. Presently she heard him come home. He hung up his hat and coat in the hall. He stood in the library doorway with a very decided scowl on his brow. Anne recalled that her impression of him the first time she'd seen him was that of a rather gentlemanly pirate, and she felt a repetition of it. "Oh, it's you, is it?" he said rather gruffly. "Well, what do you want?" He had not even offered to shake hands with her. Of the two, Anne thought the dog had decidedly the better manners. "Mr. Westcott, please hear me through patiently before..." I am patient. Very patient. Proceed. Anne decided that there was no use beating about the bush with a man like Franklin Westcott. I have come to tell you, she said steadily, that Dovey has married Jarvis Morrow. Then she waited for the earthquake. None came. Not a muscle of Franklin Westcott's lean brown face changed. He came in and sat down in the bandy-legged leather chair opposite Anne. When? He said. Last night, at his sister's, said Anne. Franklin Westcott looked at her for a moment, out of yellowish-brown eyes deeply set under penthouses of grizzled eyebrow. Anne had a moment of wondering what he had looked like when he was a baby. Then he threw back his head and went into one of his spasms of soundless laughter. You mustn't blame Dovey, Mr. Westcott, said Anne earnestly, recovering her powers of speech now that the awful revelation was over. It wasn't her fault. I'll bet it wasn't, said Franklin Westcott. Was he trying to be sarcastic? No, it was all mine, said Anne, simply and bravely. I advised her to be married. I made her do it, so please forgive her, Mr. Westcott. Franklin Westcott coolly picked up a pipe and began to fill it. If you've managed to make Sybil elope with Jarvis Morrow, Miss Shirley, you've accomplished more than I ever thought anybody could. I was beginning to be afraid she'd never have backbone enough to do it, and then I'd have to back down. And Lord, how we Westcotts hate backing down. You've saved my face, Miss Shirley, and I'm profoundly grateful to you. There was a very loud silence while Franklin Westcott tamped his tobacco down and looked with an amused twinkle at Anne's face. Anne was so much at sea she didn't know what to say. I suppose, he said, that you came here in fear and trembling to break the terrible news to me? Yes, said Anne a trifle shortly. Franklin Westcott chuckled soundlessly. You needn't have. You couldn't have brought me more welcome news. Why, I picked Jarvis Morrow out for Sybil when they were kids. As soon as the other boys began taking notice of her, I shooed them off. That gave Jarvis his first notion of her. He'd show the old man, but he was so popular with the girls that I could hardly believe the incredible luck when he did really take a genuine fancy to her. Then I laid out my plan of campaign. I knew the Morrows' root and branch. You don't. They're a good family, but the men don't want things they can get easily, and they're determined to get a thing when they're told they can't. They always go by the contraries. Jarvis's father broke 3 girls' hearts because their families threw them at his head. In Jarvis's case, I knew exactly what would happen. Sybil would fall head over heels in love with him, and he'd be tired of her in no time. I knew he wouldn't keep on wanting her if she was too easy to get. So I forbade him to come near the place and forbade Sybil to have a word to say to him, and generally played the heavy parent to perfection. Talk about charm of the uncaught. It's nothing to the charm of the uncatchable. It all worked out according to schedule, but I struck a snag in Sybil's spinelessness. She's a nice child, but she is spineless. I've been thinking she'd never have the pluck to marry him in my teeth. Now, if you've got your breath back, my dear young lady, unbosom yourself of the whole story. Anne's sense of humor had again come to her rescue. She could never refuse an opportunity for a good laugh, even when it was on herself, and she suddenly felt very well acquainted with Franklin Westcott. He listened to the tale, taking quite enjoyable whiffs of his pipe. When Anne had finished, he nodded comfortably. I see. I'm more in your debt even than I thought. She'd never have got up the courage to do it if it hadn't been for you. And Jarvis Morrow wouldn't have risked being made a fool of twice, not if I know the breed. Gosh, I've had a narrow escape. I'm yours to command for life. You're a real brick to come here as you did, believing all the yarns gossip told you. You've been told aplenty, haven't you now? Anne nodded. The bulldog had got his head on her lap and was snoring blissfully. Everyone agreed that you were cranky, crabbed, and crusty, she said candidly. And I suppose they told you I was a tyrant and made my poor wife's life miserable and ruled my family with a rod of iron. Yes, but I really did take all that with a grain of salt, Mr. Westcott. I felt that Dovey couldn't be as fond of you as she was if you were as dreadful as gossip painted you. Sensible gal. My wife was a happy woman, Miss Shirley, and when Mrs. Captain Montgomery tells you I bullied her to death, tick her off for me. Excuse my common way. Molly was pretty, prettier than Sybil. Such a pink and white skin, such golden brown hair, such dewy blue eyes. She was the prettiest woman in Summerside. Had to be. I couldn't have stood it if a man had walked into church with a handsomer wife than me. I ruled my household as a man should, but not tyrannically. Oh, of course, I had a spell of temper now and then, but Molly didn't mind them after she got used to them. A man has a right to have a row with his wife now and then, hasn't he? Women get tired of monotonous husbands. Besides, I always gave her a ring or a necklace or something gaudy after I calmed down. There wasn't a woman in Summerside had more nice jewelry. I must get it out and give it to Sybil. Anne went wicked. What about Milton's poems? Milton's poems. Oh, that. It wasn't Milton's poems, it was Tennyson's. I reverence Milton, but I can't abide Alfred. He's too sickly sweet. Those last 2 lines of Enoch Arden made me so mad one night. I did fire the book through the window, but I picked it up the next day for the sake of the bugle song. I'd forgive anybody anything for that. It didn't go into George Clark's lily pond. That was old Prouty's embroidery. You're not going? Stay and have a bite of supper with the lonely old fellow robbed of his only whelp. I'm really sorry. I can't, Mr. Westcott, but I have to attend a meeting of the staff tonight. Well, I'll be seeing you when Sybil comes back. I'll have to fling a party for them, no doubt. Good gosh, what a relief this has been to my mind. You've no idea how I've hated to have to back down and say, take her. Now, all I have to do is to pretend to be heartbroken and resigned and forgive her sadly for the sake of her poor mother. I'll do it beautifully. Jarvis must never suspect. Don't you give the show away. I won't, promised Anne. Franklin Westcott saw her courteously to the door. The bulldog sat upon his haunches and cried after her. Franklin Westcott took his pipe out of his mouth at the door and tapped her on the shoulder with it. Always remember, he said solemnly, there's more than one way to skin a cat. It can be done so that the animal will never know he's lost his hide. Give my love to Rebecca Dew, a nice old puss, if you stroke her the right way, and thank you. Thank you. Anne betook herself home through the soft, calm evening. The fog had cleared, the wind had shifted, and there was a look of frost in the pale green sky. People told me I didn't know Franklin Westcott, reflected Anne. They were right, I didn't, and neither did they. How did he take it? Rebecca Dew was keen to know. She'd been on tenterhooks during Anne's absence. Not so badly after all, said Anne confidentially. Ooh. I think he'll forgive Dovey in time. I never did see the beat of you, Miss Shirley, for talking people round, said Rebecca Dew admiringly. You have certainly got away with you. Something attempted, something done has earned a night's repose, quoted Anne warily as she climbed the 3 steps into her bed that night. But just wait till the next person asks my advice about eloping.